All right. Hey there, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. Appreciate you getting logged in today. Question: where for you would be the worst place you could get stuck for a day? Andy going with work? Sounds like might be a challenging place of employment then. Oh, yeah, Jason, that would be difficult. Um, I think for me, I hate being cold. For me, it's like the worst. So being stuck anywhere that's like cold the entire day, if it's like stuck outside all day during the winter, or like stuck in a freezer or something like that, that would probably be my nightmare. And yeah, Keegan, other people they love it. Um, but like for me, like I don't even like having like a fan on me when I'm like trying to go to sleep. I'm like, no, it's cold air. Get it off me. Being stuck in public school all day. I assume like in a brick and mortar school. I hear that. Oftentimes, the reason students come to our school is something wasn't working right at a brick and mortar school. Ooh, and Andy, that sounds like a real dilemma then. Yeah, luckily for me, I do not need to be cold to fall asleep because, yeah, I would struggle with that. Good, good. Um, Feel free to share any other answers in the chat. Um, Game plan for today. Um, Kind of a bit of odds and ends for Unit 4. We'll quickly talk about the concept of bipartisanship, which ties back into our discussion the other day about uh, liberal versus conservative. And then we're going to kind of get into the concept of political models, which would include the political spectrum and the Nolan chart, kind of different ways of visualizing political views. And then I'm hoping that we'll also get into the topic of political socialization today, but we'll see how things go. Um, just give me one minute here to send out the late email. Okay. Um, to start us off, then, pulling a student question for today. I figured this is one we could probably work through as a group. Uh, One of you asking, why don't we have a monarchy here in the United States? And Jorgen, no, we have not yet. That's probably something we're going to discuss on Monday. Um, why might that be? Why might here in the United States might we not have a monarchy? Yeah, Jorgen, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so the reason why we don't have a mono- monarchy is because it has to do with how we're set up with the country and kind of they just fought a war with Britain like a couple years ago, not like years ago, more like thousands of years ago. So they
Hundreds.
hundreds of years ago, sorry, with Britain trying to figure out they don't want to be ruled by a king or queen, and then if we have a monarchy, that's kind of the same thing of being ruled by a king, queen, dictator, and the country doesn't really want that because it's too similar to what we had with Britain.
Excellent. Really good answer. Yes, a lot of it would be tied into the history of the American Revolution. There was this big Revolutionary War to get away from the British monarchy, and so the last thing that Americans wanted was to then create an American monarchy. In fact, when George Washington served as the first president of the country under the Constitution, one of the key focuses of his presidency was trying to differentiate what it means to be a president versus what people associated with monarchies, kings and queens, and all of that. Um, including that idea that presidents aren't around forever. Presidents step down; they let someone else take over that position of power. Whereas a king or queen typically holds on to that position for life. Excellent. All right. So then let's do a quick polling question here just to review from the other day and get us back into the mindset of where we were. So on Tuesday, we looked at kind of general differences between a conservative political viewpoint and a liberal political viewpoint. We, for example, talked about the fact that conservatives generally embrace the idea of rugged individualism, that every person in America has to figure out success for their own. Government shouldn't be providing too much assistance. People have to rise or fall on their own based on their own efforts. By comparison, which of these four would tend to be something important that liberals look out for? Would it be A, big business, B, the central government, C, personal responsibility, or D, disadvantaged people? Out of those four, which might we say tends to be most important to the liberal political perspective? Good. Thank you for those of you who responded already. If you haven't yet, go ahead and use the polling tools to make your selection. If you're on a cell phone or you just got logged in and the polling tools aren't showing up, you can always send me your choice as a private chat message. That lets me know that you are here and participating still. Let's see here. Still looking for a response from Noah, Megan, Destiny, and Gracie. And thank you, Noah. All right. Oh, yeah, sorry. Sometimes I forget when we have more than one person with the same name in a class period. All right, good. Yeah, let's talk about this. So ultimately, those of you who went with D would be right. Because as we talked about the other day, liberals are more likely to argue that that should be a big concern for government, is looking at, are there people in the country that are being left behind in one way or another? Whether that's because of discrimination or because of their economic situation, but that government should actively take a role in trying to provide support to those who are struggling within the country. So that can include creating economic assistance programs like food stamps or Medicaid, to help provide health insurance to low-income Americans or people who maybe wouldn't be able to get insurance other way. Or it could be, passing laws to address a history of discrimination. Ensuring racial minorities or women have equal access to education or employment opportunities, things like that. Now, quite a few people picked B. And you're kind of on the right track there because ultimately liberals want to use the central government in order to achieve their goal of helping disadvantaged people. So it's not so much that liberals want to look out for central government or what have you, but it's more of the view that government is the path to helping out disadvantaged people. If you don't use government to pass laws against discrimination, or you don't use government to create social programs, providing economic assistance, then those people will continue to be disadvantaged. Whereas conservatives are more likely to say, "Hey, we kind of believe that everyone has to figure, out their own success individually on their own. So you don't need a big central government. Keep government small, keep government kind of out of the economy. Let people, figure out success or failure on their own." So that would kind of be the difference there. Um, Real quick, green check mark if that makes sense, or red X if I lost you and we need more clarification on that, which is totally fine. That was just a question where we had people picking a lot of different answers. So I just want to double check of like, does that make sense now or not? But okay, all green check marks. I'll take that. We'll move forward. So, as you've maybe noticed from time to time on the news or on social media, um, there's quite a political divide in the United States right now between liberals and conservatives. Democrats versus Republicans. In fact, we made political history on Tuesday with the House of Representatives voting to remove the Speaker of the House. That's the first time that has ever happened in U.S. history that a Speaker of the House has been removed from power. So, politically intense times. But from time to time, we see liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans work together. And when the two parties or the two political viewpoints work together, that is what's known as bipartisanship. That is often something presidents at least talk about wanting to have as they run for office. There's a quote from John F. Kennedy. It's one of those things that is easy to want, but can sometimes be hard to do in practice. But to try to give you a modern example, when we first started having the COVID shutdowns, there was a bipartisan effort to provide assistance to the country. We started kind of having these red flashing lights that the economy was really going to be in trouble with the COVID shutdowns. And so Democrats and Republicans in Congress worked together to pass COVID relief that, included sending out stimulus checks, um, kind of put a pause on people having to pay back student loans, a pause on preventing people being evicted or kicked out of apartments, things like that. Providing loans to small businesses so they wouldn't go under during the COVID shutdown. So that would be a relatively recent example of bipartisanship, something where both liberals and conservatives in Congress, Democrats and Republicans said, okay, this is a serious situation the country is facing. We both kind of agree that the government needs to do something. Well, let's come together and get something done. Doesn't happen often these days, but every now and then. All right. So let's then get into the topic of political models. And as a starting point to kind of understand what we mean by political model, uh, let's first look at a toy model. So may seem obvious here, but what is this a model of? This picture that you see here on the whiteboard. Yeah, obviously it's a model of a plane. I wasn't trying to trick you there. Uh, but obviously it's not a working plane. Like if we were able to shrink a pilot down, we couldn't put that pilot here in this plane and the pilot would be able to fly it. Um, so it's obviously not a perfectly accurate representation of a plane. Um, you know, but how did we all still know it was a plane? Even though it's just a model, it's not a perfect reproduction. Right, because it has the main defining characteristics of a plane. It's got wings, it's got a propeller, it's got the distinct shape of a plane. Right. So we don't necessarily have all the nitty gritty details that a real working plane would have, but it gives us enough of the impression or the picture of the plane that we know what we're looking at. So that's the same concept when we talk about political models. A political model is a system or a graphic or an image for representing and mapping political reality. Um, and in trying to model or map political views, inevitably you're going to have to simplify things because political views can go in all kinds of directions. And if you were going to try to create some sort of visual model that would keep track and map all of that, it would have to be some sort of like 5-dimensional image of, going in a bunch of different directions. It would be so complicated to look at that it would basically be meaningless. So we kind of got to simplify things. We got to smooth out some of the details while still keeping in focus the main features that are most important. So, one example of a political model would be what's called the political spectrum. Uh, which, again, just so we're all on the same page, just in general, what does it mean if we're talking about something being on a spectrum? You might, for example, be from science class, be familiar with the light spectrum. What are we looking at there? Or what does that mean, kind of looking at a spectrum? Yeah, Jorgen.
A different way of a spectrum. For example, I'm on the autism spectrum of me being so I'm not so much autistic or less autistic, so I'm kind of on a midway point where you're kind of going from left or right of it, and then trying to figure out, okay, where you're on the Asperger spectrum, which I am, then you are considered. We're kind of identifying them as a whole, and then we're just going to put you on either left or right of the spectrum, or the left or right of the main thing scale. So basically, it's a scale.
Yeah, excellent. And Braden, I'm going to come back to your question. Although, thank you, Jason. Yeah, so if we talk about something being on a spectrum, it's like imagining we have something on a horizontal line, and then we can measure something either being more, on one side of the line or the other. Like the autistic spectrum, you can have some people that, have just some small characteristics associated with autism. And then you can have other people that are further along on the spectrum, have more pronounced characteristics of autism. So it's a way of kind of measuring or tracking kind of where does a person lie. And so, as Jason says, can vary depending on characteristics. Um, and yeah, it's a really good example to use. Um, or the same thing with the light spectrum. Based on a light's wavelength, that determines the color of that light. So as the wavelength stretches or compresses, we visually see that as a different color. So we can also have what's called the political spectrum, which is kind of the same idea of measuring a political viewpoint as leaning more to the left or leaning more to the right. And the political spectrum that we have here, of kind of plotting them on this line or this geometric axis, is what is more important? Do you put a bigger emphasis on equality, or do you put a bigger emphasis on strength and security? Um, so, as a political view leans more to the left on this spectrum, it wants government to take more dramatic actions to try to create a society of equality. So, as we talked about the other day, liberals want government to provide some assistance by doing things like maybe taxing the rich at a higher amount, or government, creating different programs to provide economic assistance to low income people. So that's not trying to create a society where everyone's equal, but it's trying to smooth out the edges a little bit. And then as you go into socialism, that would be government taking bigger actions to try to create equality. So that might be government, collecting more taxes from everyone, but then government providing services to everyone, things like healthcare, education, housing. I think it's in Sweden, for example, that whenever a mother has a child, the government automatically sends that mother a box full of baby essentials, diapers, wipes, clothes, bottles, and even the box itself can then be converted into a crib. Um, and it doesn't matter if that mother is rich or poor. That's something the government, just provides to every mother when they have a baby. That would kind of be an example of a more socialist system of government more directly providing equal services to everyone. And then if we get to communism, that's when the government basically has total control over the economy and handles the distribution of things, arguably with the intent of trying to make things equal. Although, if you're at all familiar with history, the reality of communist countries is it does not end up working out that way and tends to be a very unequal system. If we go the other direction, leaning more towards the right, there tends to be a bigger emphasis on tradition and security. So we talked about on Tuesday, conservatives that do tend to put emphasis on tradition. They oftentimes want government to pass laws trying to maintain tradition, such as maybe traditional views on marriage, uh, or on birth control, things like that. Of like, how did we do things in the past? Let's kind of keep that as it was. And then also, they tend to put a bigger emphasis on the strength and security of the state. So that usually means more spending on military and policing. That's one of the reasons why conservatives tend to place a bigger concern on immigration, um, compared to liberals. But then as you go further out to the right, those views become more extreme. When we get to something like Nazism or fascism, you know, Hitler arguing that the German tradition was only for, true Aryan Germans, and that if you were not part of that true German tradition, you were viewed as an outsider, you were viewed as a threat, that needed to be closely watched, potentially arrested. Of course, then, you get into the horrors of the Holocaust with the Jewish people being targeted as an outsider that are not welcome and don't belong. And then, of course, also, obviously, a big emphasis on security and strength. Nazism spending a lot of money on the military and policing and kind of keeping a close eye on everything. So that would be the spectrum. If you're more in the middle of the spectrum, you have more moderate political views. You don't really want government going too far in either direction. Then as you go further out to the right or the left, you kind of want government to take a bigger role in trying to achieve those goals that you want. Here's kind of another example of the same idea of a political spectrum, the left-right political spectrum, which I don't recall if I mentioned this back on Tuesday, but the terms left and right come from the French Revolution. When you started to have the discussions in France of should we change our government, those who sat to the left of the king wanted change, wanted reform. They would be labeled as being more liberal in believing that government needed to make changes. Whereas those who sat to the right of the king wanted the king to continue to be in charge. They wanted to hold on to tradition. They were less open to the idea of change. And so ultimately, our measurement here on the left-right political spectrum would be openness to change. Now, in reality, is that the only way people kind of determine their political views, is how open or comfortable they are to change? Our presidential debates, just one question of like, hey, tell me how open to change you are. Is that all we look at politically in the real world? Right, of course not. In reality, politics is looking at a bunch of different issues. Uh, Taxes, military, education, energy policy. And the reality for most people is that on some of those things, they may be more open to change. In other areas, they may be less open to change. So it's a model. It's a simplification of things. And that's one of the benefits of the left-right political spectrum is it's a very simple model. We're basically using one measurement. How open to change are you? If you're more open to change, you lean more liberal. If you're less open to change, you're probably more conservative. But of course, politics in reality is a lot more complicated than that. You can have someone who, for example, is maybe more conservative on immigration, wants to see the government do more to crack down on immigration, but they may be more liberal when it comes to something like environmental issues and believes that government should do more to address climate change. You can have someone who can have both of those views. That doesn't easily get measured on the left-right political spectrum because we only have one measurement point. So on Tuesday, we talked about liberal and conservative, but we also have these terms radical and reactionary. And a radical, like a liberal, would agree that more should be done to embrace change. And a reactionary would agree with a conservative that more should be done to hold on to tradition or keep things as the status quo or to try to even take things back to how they were in the past. The difference, though, is once you kind of reach that category of radical or reactionary, you believe in extreme action must be taken to achieve your goal. So whereas liberals and conservatives believe that they can achieve their goals within the political system, A radical or a reactionary would argue that no, we've gone beyond the political system. We need to break the political system, or we need to go outside of the political system to achieve our goals. And Braden, yeah, I'll come back to that here in just a moment. So one unfortunate recent example of kind of this viewpoint we've seen in the United States would be the January 6th riots in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, where you had a group of people who stormed the Capitol building, were trying to hunt down members of Congress, trying to stop the certification of the election. That would be labeled as a reactionary movement, because at that point, they were no longer operating within the political system. They had come to the conclusion that they had to break the political system in order to achieve their goals. So that would kind of be the distinction of, what separates a liberal from a radical or a conservative from a reactionary, is when you believe that extreme action must be taken. So on the other hand, then, what do you think it means if someone is here in this area labeled moderate center? Or, Braden, to your question, this is where you would put a generalist. What do you think that mean? What does that maybe telling us about a person's political views if they end up being put here in this moderate center category? Yeah, Jorgen.
Doesn't moderate kind of mean they're not, they're just in the middle? They don't more agree with the more action to be done, or more tradition to be held on to, something like that. So they're basically in the middle, so they don't really agree with the liberal or the reactionary. They're just kind of in the middle doing their own thing.
Yeah, and answers in the chat would fit in this too. It could be a couple of different things. One, it could be someone who likes a little bit of both. They don't strongly enough lean to the left or the right. They're kind of in the middle. So it could be someone whose opinion is kind of in between. Again, maybe there's some things where they're like, I like the liberal response on this topic, but maybe I like the conservative response on that topic. So they're kind of a mix of both. So we kind of put them in between. It could also be someone that's kind of politically apathetic. They don't really care too much one way or another. You also have people who put a big emphasis on compromise. Okay, well, if the liberals want this and the conservatives want that, I want whatever's in between those two. So those voters, oftentimes called moderates, or they land in the center, or generalist is another term we could use, as Braden mentioned. So this is one political model. Let's quickly look at another one. Another political model we have is what's called the Nolan chart. And the Nolan chart's a little bit more fancy because instead of just having one measurement or one axis, it has two axes. We're making two measurements of people's political views. Such as, people answering a survey, we would then give them a score on how they measure for personal freedom and a score for how they measure on economic freedom. Personal freedom would be referring to how little do you want the government involved in people's private lives. So the more you say, hey, government shouldn't be determining how people live their lives, government should kind of let people live their lives how they want, you would then have a higher personal freedom score. So for example, because liberals tend to be more likely to be accepting of, gay rights or legalizing marijuana, they would get a higher personal freedom score, whereas conservatives are more likely to support government um, passing laws, putting restrictions on, marriage rights or abortion rights, things like that. They get a lower personal freedom score on the Nolan chart. When it comes to economic freedom, that's then looking at how much do you want government to be involved in regulating or controlling the economy. Um, and so, since conservatives tend to not want the government too involved in the economy or regulating businesses or passing higher taxes, they get a higher economic freedom score, whereas liberals tend to argue that business regulations need to be put in place. They get a lower economic freedom score. And so we could then take a person's two scores and mark them on the Nolan chart. As you can kind of see here, looking at a couple of different political figures and ultimately how their political views have changed over time. So one of the nice things about the Nolan chart is it provides us with a little bit more detail. We're now looking at two data points instead of just one. What is sometimes viewed as being a criticism of the Nolan chart is that it is very much a model that is built upon a libertarian mindset, which we haven't talked about libertarianism yet. But a libertarian is basically someone who believes that government should be as uninvolved in things as possible, that government should be as small as possible, both in economics and in people's day-to-day lives. And so the Nolan chart kind of assumes that government being less involved in the economy means more economic freedom. But some people might argue it's not that simple. Because if, for example, you gave businesses total freedom to run their business however they want, how might that kind of result in a worse economic situation for some people if businesses could kind of operate or do whatever they want? If businesses could do, yeah, excellent, Jorgen. Businesses might take advantage of people in some ways. They might decide to cheat their employees um, by underpaying them um, or docking their pay in unfair ways. Or they may decide to start selling food products without properly including all the ingredients they include in it. That would give the business more freedom, but arguably that doesn't give the employee or the customer as much freedom. But based on the measurements of the Nolan chart, this is kind of how we would characterize the four political views that the Nolan chart tracks. So again, a libertarian would be someone who doesn't want the government involved in people's personal lives or in the economy. Um, a conservative would agree with that idea of keep the government out of the economy. But again, conservatives placing a big emphasis on tradition often want government to pass laws to kind of keep that tradition in place, kind of keep things as they were in the past in terms of how society operates. Whereas a liberal would generally agree with the libertarian that government shouldn't be telling people how to live their lives, who they have a relationship with, things like that. But liberals would argue that government should be involved in regulating the economy, setting minimum standards and requirements for businesses, things like that. Let's go ahead and jump into polling. I want to make sure we don't run out of time here. So, talking about polling, uh, polling in general simply refers to asking people questions and getting their input. So for example, when I bring up, you know, the polling tools like this, and I ask you all, hey, which expression do you currently agree with the most? The green face, the yellow face, the red face. That's me taking a polling question. I'm trying to get data. I'm trying to get feedback on what are people thinking, or in this case, how are people feeling? And so some of you put you feeling good. You got the green smiley face. We got one person kind of neutral in the middle. One person maybe not having the best day today. Hope your day gets better. If you hit the red face, but that would just be, a quick example of polling. So politicians and the media regularly engage in polling to ask Americans about their political views and how they plan to vote. Why? If you were a politician, if you were running for Congress or running for the presidency, why might you want a lot of polling asking people about their political views and how they plan to vote? Why might that be valuable if you're a politician? Getting this data on Americans' political views and how they plan to vote. Yeah, Jorgen, go ahead.
It makes people say that I want to vote libertarian because I feel this way, and then kind of gives a point like where they're okay. So there's more people agreeing with my viewpoint, and there's less people agreeing with mine, or there's kind of in the middle trying to figure out who's agreeing with you and who's not agreeing with you, and who's trying to has the same views. And then if more people are agreeing with you, then you're going to stick with that. But if less people are agreeing with you, whatever your point is, then you're probably going to ditch that point and get rid of it.
Yeah. So one, as Jorgen mentions, is it then kind of allows politicians to kind of calibrate or think about, okay, what seems to be kind of the political viewpoint of voters right now, and how do I maybe do a better job of appealing to that or connecting to that? Or to Sam's comment, absolutely, to kind of know your chances. How does it seem like we're doing? If we ask a bunch of people how they're planning to vote, and most people say they're going to vote for us, okay, looks like we're in a good spot. Let's just kind of keep doing what we're doing. Or if we get polling that says a lot of people are going to vote for our opponent, okay, we need to change things up. We need to kind of change our strategy in this election. For example, currently, I live close to Indianapolis, so on the radio, I hear all the political ads for mayor, and there's currently a Republican running to be mayor of Indianapolis. But Indianapolis is a very liberal city. It tends to vote Democrat. So it's very clear to me as a government teacher listening to that Republican candidate's ads that, he's done polling. He knows he's in an uphill battle trying to win the mayor of Indianapolis as a Republican. And so the things he talks about in his ads are very different than, say, what Republicans running for president say. He's not really putting a big emphasis on immigration or things like that. Instead, he's kind of putting a big emphasis on the topic of crime in Indianapolis because he's probably done polling that has shown that is something that voters in Indianapolis are worried about. And so here then we have just some examples of models based on political polling, trying to kind of see, okay, what are the odds of, each political party, winning in the election. However, polling is ultimately very tricky. It's very difficult to conduct a poll that got an accurate measurement for the country's views. As an example, when I brought up the polling, faces, I think like 6 of you put a green smiley face, 1 of you put a neutral face, and 1 of you put an angry face. And so based off of that, I could maybe come to the conclusion that overall, everyone is feeling really happy today. We got more green faces than anything else. However, that might not be accurate because not all of you made a selection, which I did on purpose. I didn't tell you all to do it. So, for this point. So there's a good chance that maybe the people who didn't click a button, maybe that's because those people aren't feeling as motivated today. Maybe there's actually a lot more yellow and red faces, but they didn't answer the question. They didn't click a button, so I don't have that data. It's the same thing with polling. As pollsters are going around asking questions, you can't reach everyone. It's just not possible. But based on the people you miss, that may mess up your polling results. For example, in 1936, the magazine Literary Digest ran a presidential poll among its magazine subscribers that showed the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt was going to lose to his Republican challenger. Oh, Cadence, you're fine, but yes, thanks for letting me know. Now, that ends up being very wrong. Franklin D. Roosevelt easily wins re-election in 1936. So, what went wrong with the poll? Well, what do you guys think? What would be the issue of only polling magazine subscribers during the Great Depression? Why might that ultimately be a poorly designed poll if you're only asking people who are subscribed to a magazine who they're planning to vote for, and it's in the middle of the Great Depression? Yeah, a lot of people can't afford magazines at that point in time. So inadvertently, that magazine was really only asking upper and middle class Americans who they were planning to vote for. It kind of left out lower income Americans, which made up much of the country in 1936. And those voters overwhelmingly voted for Franklin D. Roosevelt because they viewed him as being a president who was actively doing things to try to help them out. So that can be the challenge in polling. If you're not accurately reaching a good representative of the country of the whole, your poll's going to be messed up. So ideally, to increase the chances of it being a good poll, it should be done by an independent agency that isn't biased one way or another. They should ask clear, straightforward questions. If a straightforward question would be, are you planning to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump, in 2024, if they end up being the candidates? That would be a good, straightforward question. If instead I ask the question of, do you want to continue the disastrous presidency of Joe Biden who's ruining America? Which that's not a personal opinion one way or another. That's just to paint a picture. That question's obviously very biased. That's a question that's trying to get the person to say, oh, well, no, I don't want to vote for that. That sounds terrible. So ideally, we want our questions to be kind of fair, simple, and neutral. We also want to avoid kind of just cherry picking, asking a certain group of people. Again, if you were going to try to figure out how the state of Indiana was going to vote, but you only asked people in Indianapolis, that's going to mess up your poll because the people who live in Indianapolis are much more likely to lean liberal, vote Democratic, whereas Indiana as a whole tends to lean conservative, tends to vote Republican. So if you're only asking people in a certain area or you're only asking a certain group of people, you're going to get messed up results. I see we're unfortunately out of time, so we'll end there for today. On Monday, we'll pick up with political socialization, and we'll talk about demographic factors, and that'll wrap up Unit 4 for us. As always, if you have any questions, stick around, let me know. Otherwise, you are good to go. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Hope you enjoy the upcoming weekend. I will see you back here on Monday. Thanks, Noah. See ya.